So to begin, I would like to acknowledge the region where these properties are situated are within the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The land was the subject of the Crawford Purchase Treaty of 1783, which brought English loyalist settlers and allies into this region. In present day, the closest First Nation reserve to both the nature reserves we'll be speaking about today is Tyendinaga Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte First Nation, a Kanyankahaka community. We also recognize the close proximity to unceded Algonquin territory. We're thankful to all those who have lived on and cared for these lands for countless generations to this day. We really are all treaty people, and we acknowledge the longstanding colonial history that has and continues to impact members of Indigenous communities across what we now call Ontario. Our intention is to ensure that the gift of these lands and waters can be enjoyed by many for future generations, with Indigenous cultural practices, responsibilities, and inherent rights being honored and upheld. So before we get started, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers for today's webinar. Dr. Stephen Yates is our volunteer steward for Gananoque Lake Nature Reserve. He'll be joining us later on during this webinar and sharing an exciting opportunity to expand protection within this area, so please stay tuned. And of course, Caroline Schultz, our executive director, who really needs no introduction. So I'll pass it along to her to get us started with introducing us to the Frontenac Arch.
Okay, thank you, Smara. I'm not sure how the video works. I know there, we've switched over. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this webinar this evening. I'm seeing, as Smara mentioned, lots of familiar names. And I'm sure many of you, or if not most of you, know quite a lot about Ontario Nature and the work that we do, but I'll just give a very quick overview, and then I'm going to move on to speak a little bit about the Frontenac Arch generally before Smara takes over and speaks more specifically about the land that we protect through our nature reserve system. So Ontario Nature, our mission is to protect wild species and wild spaces through conservation, education, and public engagement. Excuse me. And we do this in many ways. We've mentioned, of course, direct land protection through our nature reserves work, but we also do, and Smara will be talking about our nature reserve shortly, but we also do a lot of work in terms of conservation science, and particularly community science. So some of you may be familiar with the very recently launched Ontario Reptile and Amphibian Atlas. And another thing that we have a strong focus on is developing youth leadership through our Nature Guardians program. And then I guess last but not least, is the advocacy role that we play, because one of the sort of crucial things is to ensure that we have the best laws and policies in Ontario to protect nature, protect biodiversity, species and habitats. Next slide, please. So this is just a little summary. You're seeing three of us, I guess, who are our staff with Ontario Nature, but we actually have over 30 staff. And in the summer months, our numbers swell a bit because we do take on a number of interns over the summer months. We have over 30,000 members and supporters throughout the province, and some from outside the province, and over 150 nature network groups. Through our nature reserve system, we've got 26 nature reserves. And as I mentioned, Smara will be speaking a lot more about that. But through the system, we have over 3,000 hectares protected. And just on the sort of communications front, we have one great mailing list. So that's the way that we keep in touch with many of you. Next slide, please, Smara. So I'm going to give you the sort of high-level overview of the Frontenac Arch, which is this incredible area in Eastern Ontario. And the Frontenac Arch, Samara is going to point it out because I don't have control over the mouse, but that area there is what's called the Frontenac Arch. And it's a relatively narrow bridge from the Adirondack Mountain area in the United States and linking it up to the Canadian Shield. So it's actually made up of Canadian Shield rocks. It's about 100 kilometers long and 50 kilometers wide. And it's largely exposed Precambrian bedrock, which extends across southeastern Ontario, and it's sort of generally within the Kingston Thousand Islands area. So the Precambrian rocks of the Canadian Shield that cover central and eastern North America are linked through the Adirondack Park and the Adirondack Mountain areas. And I'm going to talk in a minute about how important this is ecologically, but it's essentially a land bridge that connects these two major areas. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So here you will see the rocky outcrops. This is just an example, and this is actually within one of our nature reserves that Samara will be talking about. But these rocky outcrops are an example of the worn down stumps of what was a mountain chain that's made up of rocks that are over 1 billion years old. So some of the oldest rocks that we have in Ontario. And the forests, this is sort of typical forest, they're predominantly mixed to deciduous forest dominated by sugar maple, American beech, yellow birch, eastern hemlock, and eastern white pine, and also red pine. And particularly notable are the dry bedrock ridges that you see throughout this region. So it makes it very distinct because essentially it's in a sea of limestone or sedimentary sort of rock all around. So the Frontenac Arch really sort of stands out, and you can see the difference when you're driving on the 401 eastwards. You pass through the Frontenac Arch when you're on that journey if you're heading east. And within the Frontenac Arch, you can see elements of, or you can see plants that are typical of 5 different forest regions. So it's an incredibly biodiverse area. So the elements that you would see are species that are typical of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest. You see boreal species, Appalachian forest species, Atlantic coastal forest species, and even Carolinian forest species. So it's a great sort of confluence of different forest types. Next slide, please, Mara. So just to give you an example of some of the tree species that occur there and what their ranges are, so that you can see how Frontenac Arch is particularly unique because these species are not found generally in the that part of Ontario other than around the Frontenac Arch. So pitch pine is typical of pine barrens in the further south in northeastern North America, and you can see pitch pine along the Thousand Islands area, but also occurring as far up as oh, now I'm going to forget the name of the park. But anyway, the up a little bit further north from the Thousand Islands area. And then pignut hickory is a typical Carolinian species, and you can see that its range is much further south, generally in northeastern North America. And red spruce is typical of Atlantic coastal forest. We know that red spruce also occurs in Algonquin Park, but it's typically, a sort of feature species of forests in the Maritimes and eastern Quebec. Next slide, please. Oh, Charleston Lake Provincial Park. I just remembered. So I'm showing you again that map that shows you the Frontenac Arch. And this is just really to highlight how crucial the arch is in the life of many species, but large ranging mammals, it's particularly crucial because of their large home ranges. You can see that that ecological corridor that goes from the Adirondacks right up to Algonquin, when you have large ranging species like eastern wolf, for example, its home range is around 500 square kilometers. So having that connection does allow for free movement across large areas, and also enables populations to mix so that you don't get genetic isolation, for example, of populations that become too small. And moose, their home range is in the range of 20 square kilometers, and black bear, around 20 to 50 square kilometers. So this land bridge, and with having so much intact habitat, is absolutely fundamental because there's continuous habitat throughout that range. So really important for large mammals. Next slide, please. And of course, it's also really important for migratory birds as a corridor of continuous habitat, and as well because it has such a high level of forest cover, intact forest cover, excellent habitat for birds that are breeding in the area, and good, great habitat for forest interior species. And in fact, the cerulean warbler, which is endangered, is this is one of the sort of strongholds for cerulean warbler in North America. And then other species like rose-breasted grosbeak and scarlet tanager. Also good for species that are found more in scrubby types of habitat near the edges of larger forests. So species like golden winged warbler, because there's a lot of sort of breaks in the natural breaks in the habitat with rocky outcrops and wetlands and so on. Next slide, please. A couple of other bird species that you would find where there's good forest cover, barred owl and red-shouldered hawk. In fact, I was at our Gananoque Lake Nature Reserve actually just before we acquired it a few years ago, and I was just standing there, and a red-shouldered hawk landed about on a branch about 3 feet above my head, which is the closest I've got to a red-shouldered hawk ever. Next slide, please. And also, because of the amount of intact habitat, it is a stronghold for other species like gray rat snake, which at one point was much more widespread, but now is only found in this sort of southwestern Carolinian zone area, where it is, having a tough time just in terms of habitat cover. But a real stronghold is in the Frontenac Arch. So there are really healthy populations in the Frontenac Arch area. And anybody who lives in the area will tell stories of having rat snakes emerging from their attics, where they've maybe spent the winter and coming down through the soffits and that kind of thing. So if you live in that area or you spend time in that area, the chances are you will see a gray rat snake. And they're, as you can see from this photograph, they're excellent tree climbers. Next slide, please. So before I hand over to Smera, I just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of focus. The Frontenac Arch Biosphere Reserve is the area that is delineated in this map, which, as you can see, is a very, very large area. And the red circle that you see, that's the area where Ontario Nature has been active in acquiring land for protection. So It's the biosphere reserve is a really big area, but the area that we're focusing on is crucial because of the number of species at risk and the opportunity actually to protect habitat that's in excellent shape. And I think it's one of those instances where, we're not necessarily doing conservation to pull things back from the brink, but rather taking the opportunity to be able to protect things while there's still a lot of excellent habitat there. So I think with that, I will hand over to Smera. One thing I didn't mention with the tree species is that, with respect to the importance of the Frontenac Arch as a migration corridor, is that trees migrate, but they do so extremely slowly. It's not like animal migration, mammals or birds or whatever. But particularly important with climate change, we need to be able to ensure that tree species are able to migrate because climate change is happening and it is having an impact. So if we are going to see certain tree species persist, having that habitat, those north sort of south corridors are absolutely fundamental to the survival of many tree species. So now I will hand over to Smera and thank you. And I'll look forward to answering questions at the end.
Thank you, Caroline. Really great to have an understanding of the landscape that we're kind of exploring this evening together. But before going into the specific nature reserves that we're going to be speaking about today, I thought we'd broaden out and just show a map of where Ontario nature reserves are across southern and central Ontario. And you can see that as Caroline mentioned earlier, we have 26 nature reserves within our system, ranging all the way from St. Joseph Island and Manitoulin Island down to Pelee and all the way east to Deep River. And of course, the two properties we'll be speaking about today here, shown by the arrow, are Lost Bay and Gananoque Lake Nature Reserves. And so Lost Bay is an incredible property. I'm sure I actually see some faces here who I know names here who I know have actually visited this stunning property. It's located along Lost Bay and the Gananoque River itself, which connects both the Lost Bay and Gananoque Lake Nature Reserves. It's one of our larger properties, started off with just a few parcels and has grown from the first one being acquired in 2009 to the most recent parcel in 2023. And we have some incredible neighbors who help with stewarding the property and keeping an eye on it for us. So it hosts many of the habitats that Caroline mentioned already, and both Gananoque Lake and Lost Bay Nature Reserves have the diversity of habitats that Caroline already spoke to that you can kind of see pictured here. So in terms of property expansion, so last year we had an opportunity to expand our Lost Bay Nature Reserve, and that yellow kind of strip you see there is the parcel that we acquired. It was a 57-acre parcel or 23 hectares, and it brings the total property size up to 643 acres or 260 hectares. So we've been able to expand the protection of these lands, and really it's, as you can see kind of from this aerial imagery, I'm not sure if you're joining from a phone or from a computer, but you can see some really great contiguous habitat that already exists within the Lost Bay Nature Reserve, and that many of the species that Caroline already mentioned call this area home. And so thanks to many of our members, supporters, and donors, we were able to acquire that property. And the next step after acquisition is obviously stewardship and going out and visiting the property. So here you'll see a couple of our amazing staff. Melissa Thomas, our nature reserves ecologist, on the left, and she's also kind of on the foreground on the right here as well. And then Juliana, who was our intern last summer. So they visited the property and conducted a detailed inventory, mapping all of the different habitats that are found here, and keeping an eye out for all the species they saw and heard, and developing our list of what is found on the property. And so habitats included open rock barrens, meadow marshes, mature deciduous sugar maple and ironwood forests, and small pockets of mixed hemlock and sugar maple forests as well. And you can see Juliana here kind of looking up at this cliff. These features kind of seemingly come out of nowhere as you're walking through the forest. You can see she's surrounded by a pocket of hemlock surrounding her, and it's absolutely magnificent to come across these features. As Caroline said, really, when you learn about the geology of this area, it's even more stunning when you come across one of these worn down mountains. Yeah, and so some of the species that were observed during these surveys are listed here. And so this kind of reflects the broad diversity of habitats that are found within this parcel, from wetland species to forest interior birds to frogs on the forest floor. Really speaks to the breadth of habitats that are protected by this new parcel and across Lost Bay itself. And there were many rock barrens throughout the property, some that were more open, some more vegetated. And the one on the right was particularly spectacular because you're kind of overlooking the rest of Lost Bay, that contiguous forest, and kind of taking it all in. So that was particularly a stunning view. And these kind of outcrops are, these rock barrens, sorry, are really great habitat for skinks. So we're gonna have to do a better job of looking for them the next time we're there. So that's my goal the next time I visit this property, is to find some skinks under some of the rocks on these barrens. And of course, lots of different wetlands. So there's an open water aquatic habitat there with some floating vegetation, including water lilies and a heronry on the left. Lots of different blue herons, lots of blue herons nesting in this wetland in particular. And there's a quote from Melissa and how she kind of experienced visiting the property during her field surveys, and the cacophony of green frogs that she heard, and when she was walking through the forest, you know, the number of cerulean warblers calling is just absolutely incredible in this region, especially knowing how rare they are in other regions. And on the right, you'll see a meadow marsh here, characteristic with lots of different fern species and cattails. And this is Lost Bay. So, of course, the namesake of the property. There's a really short trail that kind of leads out into Lost Bay, and lots of different species call this home. It's absolutely spectacular to be here. When there's lots of waterfowl going through here, you'll see herons. And actually, this particular bay is home to 5 different turtle species, from Blanding's turtle, northern map turtle, eastern musk, midland painted, and snapping turtles as well. And these are found all throughout the Gananoque River system, down to Gananoque Lake Nature Reserve as well. And depending if you're joining from your phone or your computer, you might see a couple of dragonflies up here. So bonus points to anyone who can name what the species of dragonfly is in the chat. So I'll let you chime in on that if you can see that. It's a test of your ID skills, but also a test of your eyesight. So another quiz, we'll get on that. You should take a good look at this turtle and figure out what species it is first before John puts up the poll. And we're making this kind of a dual question. You have to identify what the turtle species is, and then you also have to tell us where this turtle species is most commonly found basking. So A, is it on rocks? B, is it on logs? C, under floating vegetation? And D, on tree branches.
Thanks, Mara. The answer's just rolling in now. I'll give it a few more seconds.
I'll give you the answer to the dragonfly question. I feel like a bunch. Okay. Maya, good. Thanks for guessing. It's actually 12 spotted skimmers. You could kind of see the black and white on the wings, but I know that was a tough one. Just warming you up for these quizzes. All right, so it looks like it's kind of stagnated. I think everyone's answered. So we have 48% of people saying on rocks, 32% on logs, and 19% under floating vegetation, and 1% on tree branches. While I wish we had arboreal turtle species in Ontario, we do not. But this is actually the eastern musk turtle, so it's a species of special concern. And I know we often see turtles basking on rocks and logs, but this is one of the rare species that you don't commonly see doing that. They're mostly aquatic, and they're commonly found aqua basking under floating vegetation at the surface of the water where it's kind of the warmest. And they're rarely seen sunning themselves on exposed rocks or logs. So yeah, kind of a fun one, and maybe also why you may not have seen as many musk turtles unless you're getting in the water, putting on some snorkeling gear, and doing a technique for searching for them that's called raccooning, where you kind of put your hands underneath and feel under the lily pads to kind of see them. But yeah, they're fun to survey for. But yeah, they're actually another interesting fact about them is they are the smallest species of turtle in Ontario. A lot of people think the spotted turtle is, but they are just slightly smaller at about 10 centimeters carapace length. So that's the top shell, versus spotted turtles are 14 centimeters. So great job. Lots of great answers there. Okay, so then moving on, in addition to surveying the property, we also love to connect with the local communities when we go to our nature reserves and get everyone involved in the work that we do. And so we hosted our annual garlic mustard removal with a local elementary school. These students learn about biodiversity as part of their curriculum, and they join us every year to pull this invasive species and learn about stewardship actions that protect these areas. And of course, they really enjoy walking on the property and learning a little bit about the species that call this area home. So kind of switching gears to our Gananoque Lake Nature Reserve. So this nature reserve is just a hop, skip, and a jump away from Lost Bay, just down the river. And it's located just a couple kilometers away. And this is our newest addition to our nature reserve system as a whole. So this nature reserve was established in 2020. And it currently sits at 147 hectares or 358 acres. And again, a lot of the amazing characteristics of the Frontenac Arch, from towering hickory and sugar maple trees and this mid-aged hardwood forest to wetlands, shoreline along the Gananoque River, and marsh habitat as well. And so you'll hear, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, you'll hear from our volunteer steward, Stephen Yates, who keeps a watchful eye on this property for us. So as I mentioned, this is our Gananoque Lake Nature Reserve. You'll see that there's quite a bit of shoreline habitat. More than half of this property is actually aquatic, with marsh. And then Wiltsey Creek goes through here, and that's part of a provincially significant wetland. And we have a 6-hectare wetland up here as well. And the remainder is mostly deciduous forest. It's mid-age, as I mentioned. It was previously logged a really long time ago, and then farming, but now it's a mid-aged forest and has characteristics starting to have characteristics of more of a mature forest in certain areas as well. And so really, really great habitat for many of the species in this area. So this is one of the towering sugar maple trees on the property. So you can, sorry. Did I lose everyone? Okay, no, I think I'm good. Sorry, this is a white oak. I don't know why I said sugar maple. Yeah, so this is a giant white oak on the property, and kind of a characteristic of some of the larger individuals that we see within the property, and surrounded by sugar maples and shagbark hickory, American beech, and ironwood throughout. The forest also does have a bit of a southern character with some butternut trees. Unfortunately, many of them are affected by butternut canker, but are still somewhat healthy. And then another species that's worth highlighting that's found on the property is slippery elm. So this is a species found within the Frontenac Arch. And even though it's called slippery elm, the leaves are quite rough, kind of like sandpaper. And of course, there are also some small pockets of mixed forest with eastern hemlock throughout as well. And kind of taking a tour down to the bottom of the nature reserve, I mentioned the aquatic habitats. There's quite a bit of marsh habitat, and of course, Wilty Creek. You can see there's pickerel weed here and lots of floating vegetation throughout, and it opens up into Gananoque Lake as well. And there's cattail marsh, there's sections of wild rice here, as well as water lily portions as well. So quite a diverse variety of different wetland habitats that host many different fish, bird species. And while paddling through here, commonly you can see wood ducks, hooded mergansers. We've also observed least bittern, which is a threatened species, and of course many great blue herons throughout this area as well. And so when we first acquired the property, we had great plans to host a BioBlitz, but of course it was 2020. And so our plans had to kind of divert, and we had some experts come out and do some surveys. And you can see some of them in these photos here. And so on the top left, you'll see Chris Grooms in the 6-hectare wetland on the northern portion of the property, and it's a really beautiful wetland dominated by swamp loosestrife. On the bottom right, you'll see Steve in the blue shirt, some staff and experts exploring one of the smaller wetlands where we found many amphibian species such as green frogs and bullfrogs. We also flipped a lot of logs and found a lot of salamanders, both spotted salamanders and redback salamanders. And on the bottom left, you can see a gray rat snake. I don't know how well you can see it against kind of the shade, but these are found throughout the property. And as Caroline mentioned, they're endangered within the Carolinian region, and in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence population, they're within the Carolinian within the Carolinian region, they're endangered, and then in Great Lakes St. Lawrence, they're actually threatened. And so they're quite abundant on the property, and especially, I'm sure Steve will mention, there's a couple trees where they're always hanging out, and I like to call gray rat snakes kind of the teenagers. They come out a little bit later because they warm up inside the hollows of trees and come out a bit later than some of the other snakes do. And they're expert tree climbers because they have these enlarged scales along their belly that kind of extend up the sides of the snake's body and allows them to kind of hug and grip trees as they move up. So they're a great arboreal climber along with the eastern fox snake. And some other snake species we've observed here include northern water snakes, kind of more along the Gananoque Lake shoreline, and then milk snakes, which are always stunning to spot. And on the top right, you can see a ruffed grouse. Whenever I'm walking through the woods and I hear one of these, I always get a little startled. And some of the birds that Caroline already mentioned, I absolutely love when we're walking through the property and just hear so many cerulean warblers calling. During the BioBlitz, we heard so many males calling territorially throughout the property. We have golden wing warblers as well, more along edge habitats, as well as indigo buntings, and then yellow-throated vireos, which are a bit more rare, found interior as well. And I think we have Diane actually joining today. I think I saw her name on the list of participants. So Diane Lepage is shown in this photo. She's a moth expert. And so one of my favorite parts of the BioBlitz was setting up this light sheet to attract moths. And you can see her kind of taking a photo of some of them to ID later. And we saw so many different species. It's really for those of us who are night owls. I don't think mothing and birding necessarily go hand in hand. You have to be up really early for one and late for the other. But this was spectacular. We saw so many interesting species. And here you can see the giant leopard moth on the top right and the Virginia creeper sphinx moth on the bottom right. And finally, in 2021, we were able to host a public BioBlitz. So many of you joined as experts to lead hikes or to enjoy the property. And so we had hikes on a variety of taxa, from birds, reptiles, and amphibians to plants. And you can see, again, I mentioned we flipped lots of logs and saw lots of salamanders. And again, saw a barred owl on the property. That was incredible. It was just kind of politely waiting in a tree for every single participant to walk by and get a really, really good look before it flew away. And again, lots of gray rat snakes, which are, of course, our largest snake species in Ontario, reaching up to about 2 meters in length. So we've got more quizzes for you. I hope you're in the mood. I know it's getting around dinner time, so I hope you still have energy and brain power to fill this out. So take a great look at this picture of this moth on the left, and we want to match it up with the larval caterpillar stage on the right. So which caterpillar on the right matches up with the adult moth on the left is the question. So I think John launched the poll, and we'll see your answers rolling in. I think the most charismatic moths have to be these giant silk moths. They're just spectacular when you come upon them.
Yeah, I'm gonna end the poll now.
Okay. So this is B. It's the Io moth. It has very, very prickly stingers. I've unfortunately been stung by one on Peely, actually, when I was doing surveys for snakes. I'll never forget it. Very, very piercing sting and very beautiful caterpillar. So these should get easier as we go along because it's the exact same caterpillars, but different moths. So you're matching up the moth on the left with the caterpillar on the right. And I think this one might be the easiest one. We'll see. I don't know if everyone else can see the poll, so I don't know how many hints to give.
Oh, I'm gonna close the poll in 5 seconds.
Okay, so everyone knows this. Everyone's incredible. All right, so this is the horrid Zale. I just love the name. So that was C. The caterpillar feeds on viburnums, which is really interesting. So the third one, these are getting easier and easier as you go along. This one, I think everyone should know what this species is. I feel like the most popular or charismatic moth, I think. Giant sphinx. Those little tails on the bottom are pretty characteristic of this species too. But the two caterpillars left are kind of similar.
5 seconds.
All right, so most of you got it right. It's A. So this is also yeah, a really common species that you're gonna find. And so obviously, I think everyone should know this now. I think this one everyone's gonna get 100%. All right.
Okay, 5 seconds.
Yeah, looks like you're all getting it right. It is, oh, looks like the poll ended. Yeah, so that's a D. So this is the marbled green leuconicta moth. And what I think is really interesting is that larva in that specific photo is eating water hemlock, which is a poisonous plant. All right, so quiz time is over. You can rest your brain. We'll go back to talking about our nature reserves. So yeah, kind of zooming out again, you can see kind of the landscape context of the area. So over here, we have our Lost Bay Nature Reserve. This is the river that goes down to Gananoque Lake and kind of down here. And so this is our Gananoque Lake Nature Reserve. And then over here, the yellow parcel is the potential acquisition that we'll be talking about. So as I mentioned, we have an incredible opportunity to expand our Gananoque Lake Nature Reserve. As you can see, this area, as well as this property, hosts many rare species and diverse habitats. And so expanding protection is a win-win here. As you can see, there's some shoreline habitat. We have contiguous forest, some wetlands here, and some rock barrens as well. And so lots of different habitats that are really contiguous with our Gananoque Lake Nature Reserve. And so this parcel is owned by Stephen Yates, who's our volunteer steward and neighbor of our property. And so from that view, from that peninsula, this is what you see overlooking the Gananoque Lake. And you have kind of a little bay or inlet here. Gananoque Lake is home to the American eel, which is a threatened species in Ontario and endangered within Canada. Grass pickerel, which is a species of special concern, as well as many other aquatic species. Obviously, the lake also supports a diversity of waterfowl and insects. And so if this lot were to be put up on the market, cottagers could potentially develop the shoreline and with some rezoning applications. And obviously we want to maintain this intact habitat, especially with the continuity that it has within Gananoque Lake Nature Reserve. And so these natural shorelines are really important habitat for many species. Like I mentioned, it can act as fish nurseries where there isn't as much of a current, supports many wading birds, and of course, turtles that are basking and feeding along the shoreline as well. And some incredible features within the property. Here you'll see more of a deciduous forest, surrounded by sugar maple and ironwood and shagbark hickory, which are really characteristic of this property and this parcel. And we were walking the parcel together, me and Steve and our colleague Marcus, and we came across this cliff, which obviously Steve took us to, and just magnificent to see. Obviously, we don't have a person for scale here, but it is quite large and impressive. And this is just one of many of these features throughout the property. And there's several outcrops. So earlier I showed some kind of more open rock barrens. So this is a rock barren that's more vegetated, and you can see some red cedar on the left, and lots of opportunities for basking for reptiles and amphibians. And one thing I think that sometimes surprises people is leopard frogs are often found in rock barrens. They're one of the amphibians that's more tolerant to drying out in these landscapes rather than being super close to water. And speaking of water, also there's a bunch of vernal pools throughout the property. These are really important amphibian breeding habitats. And many species rely on them, including spotted salamanders, wood frogs that we've seen throughout, and then there's some species that are non-obligate to these vernal pools, such as spring peepers that are found throughout the forest as well. And there are minimal structures on the property. It's all intact natural habitat, but there is a couple of built features, including the shed that Steve built. And we'll be maintaining it on the property, as it'll be a really great place to store our equipment. And also there's waterfront access. So we'll be going in to survey the property using watercraft that we'll store here as well. And so with that, I'm going to pass it along to Dr. Stephen Yates. And as I mentioned, we've had the pleasure of working together since he joined as the volunteer steward in 2020, and he's the current owner of this property that we're hoping to secure with all of your support. So I'll pass it along to Dr. Stephen Yates to share his connection with the area and with this property.
Wow, thank you very much, Samara. So first of all, I should tell you, it's a real honor to be with you folks. Good evening to everybody. So as Samara said, my name is Stephen Yates. Although I'm a panelist, I'm quite different from everybody else because I'm absolutely not an expert naturalist. I'm not an expert conservationist. I'm not an expert biologist. I was actually a neurophysiologist. I did work on the brain and nervous system, and then I became a family doctor. And in the middle of my career, I actually became the director of medical care of a psychiatric hospital, and I've always had an interest in the brain and psychiatric disorders. And it stunned me one day when I was reading an article from Japan about the effect of forests on mental health and how beneficial they are. And I read a lot more about that over the years until I finally decided that I had to have a forest. And so I called a patient of mine who happens to be a real estate agent and asked him to find me a forest. And very simply, about a year later, I bought the property that Samara talked about. Not knowing much about forests, not knowing much about the biology of the species, I made myself at home in the forest, and gradually I began to realize that I don't own this forest; it's the reverse. So I've always been absolutely stunned at the studies that came from Japan dealing with anxiety disorders and depression. They actually prescribed something called Shinrin-yoku, which stands for forest bathing. And very simply, it's a very formal thing. They may not actually prescribe drugs. They may not prescribe psychotherapy. They actually send people with those disorders into the forests, and they forest bathe. And when you look at the results of forest bathing, it is absolutely just stunningly successful in terms of the rehabilitation of people with the psychiatric disorders. So I was enthralled to actually own a forest. And then I soon realized that, no, I didn't own the forest. The forest actually doesn't need me owning it. It's perfectly capable of looking after itself. And if anything, it owns me. Very quickly, I became aware of Ontario Nature, the neighbor to the south, and a friend of mine who is quite quite a bird specialist. I took her one day in a kayak around to the marshy area into the middle of the absolute paradise, and she suggested that I call Ontario Nature and see if they needed a steward of the property. One thing led to another, and very quickly I realized that to get better access to the original Ontario Nature property on this lake, you need access to the water. And because of the paradise, which is the swamp, or I call it the big swamp, historically, that's what it's called. It's a huge marsh. The current Ontario Nature property doesn't really have good access. It's very hard to launch a boat through, for example, this bay, which is probably one of the more open areas. Whereas my property just to the north has excellent water access. And so talking to Samira over the while, it became obvious that the win-win for this situation was that I should not own my property. I should be a steward of my property and a steward of Ontario Nature. And I wish I could have donated the whole property to Ontario Nature, but the funding tells me otherwise. So as it is, I've donated some of the funding to Ontario Nature, and I'm hoping they come up with the rest. So this particular picture is a picture of a bay. I'm actually sitting on where I built a deck on my property, looking at this bay. I've spent tens of hours watching families of herons, it started out with one magnificent blue heron, and then there were two, and then there were two herons and little herons. I don't know what baby herons are called, but clearly this was a family nesting, and there have been many of them, and I thoroughly enjoyed cycling to my property and looking at this. Samira, can you move on to the next slide? In the corner of my vision, one day, I saw my friend here, and this bench is 6 feet wide, and the snake, as you can see, is longer than that. And so my introduction to the property that I have is to first of all realize that gray rat snakes are something I have a lot of on the property, and then I've discovered trees where families of rat snakes are abounding. I don't want to go through all the species because I'm talking to experts in species. And Samira, could you move on to the next slide? And this slide, I've asked Samira to show you because this is the magnificent bird paradise on the south side of the Ontario Nature property. And that's me in a kayak, and I'm actually just outside the Wiltsea Creek. This property is monstrous. It's the actual marsh itself is 2 kilometers by about 4 kilometers. So it's about 8 square kilometers. It is a magnificent bird paradise. If you can get up in the morning early enough and be out here to see the sunrise, it is just absolutely incredible. However, it's not readily accessible from Ontario Nature as it stands right now. So it will become that way if you want to launch your kayak or your canoe from my property, which I hope becomes Ontario Nature property. And so I don't want to take up any more of your time. I'm very happy to ask questions. It's a real honor to be here, and thank you very much, Samira, for asking me to be here.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Steve. Really great to hear about your connection to the property, and we're so thankful you're working with us to expand our Gananoque Lake Nature Reserve. And I'm sure many of us can relate to some of the reasons why Steve is so connected to this region. And as he mentioned, we're really thankful that he's already contributed $60,000 towards the acquisition. So we're off to an incredible start, and we need your help to raise the total $400,000 to secure this property and expand our Gananoque Lake nature reserve and bolster the property and expand corridors for wildlife within this region that's home to so many rare species. And I don't know if any of you are joining from your computer and want to scan this QR code, it'll take you to our page where you can, our webpage where you can learn a little bit more about the property and contribute if you'd like to. And just wanted to say thank you to our donors and supporters who contributed towards expanding our Lost Bay Nature Reserve, which I mentioned earlier. We couldn't have done that without our supporters, and we hope we can continue on that ride and expand our Gananoque Lake Nature Reserve as well with all of your support. So with that, we want to thank you so much for spending your evening with us, touring some of our properties within the Frontenac Arch and learning about the biodiversity within the region. And we'll open it up for questions.
Thanks, Samara. One question we kind of got in two different forms was, given it's on given the biosphere, the broader biosphere reserve, why is it still why do you need nature reserve within that? So what protection is missing from being part of the broader reserve?
I don't know if you want to take that, Caroline, or if I should.
I'm unmuting myself. Well, you know, part of a biosphere reserve are protected areas, and of course we do have Charleston Lake Provincial Park and Frontenac Park and the St. Lawrence Islands National Park. But in that whole sort of, I'll call it a matrix of conservation, and there's conservation authority lands, and there are other entities like NCC and the Thousand Islands Watershed Land Trust, and we all, the non-government organizations, work together to identify what the priorities are for protection. And I saw another question related to, you know, not really understanding what the Nature Conservancy is doing versus us, etc. We do work very closely together so that if there is, you know, there are properties that NCC might not be in a position to acquire, we would. So the Gananoque Lake Nature Reserve was an example of that close collaboration between the two organizations. So it isn't just a single approach with government, you know, protected national or provincial parks. The land sort of conservancy, land trust component is incredibly important. And of course, the more that we can protect, you know, together, the more we're securing the future of this large but fundamentally important landscape. So that's my general comment. I don't know, Samara, if you have anything else to say.
No, I think you got it, Caroline. We're collaborating with all of the conservation organizations in the region and really have, you know, one goal, and we're all working together. So that's the main piece.
And I do have to apologize for getting Charleston Lake Provincial Park's name. I don't know. I've got one of our board members, Dan Shire, is on this webinar, and he has a cottage in Charleston Lake, so he's probably wondering how I managed to forget. But I'm almost a senior, so that's my excuse.
I messed up a couple of things too. I was calling a white oak a sugar maple, so who knows what's going on tonight.
I was happy you did that. It didn't make me look so bad.
So we had a few really positive comments about the webinar, the content, the forest bathing. I think it's a really interesting element. And a couple of people raised that already. One question that we started answering some of them in the chat, but one question came up about whether there's access to, I guess, Gananoque Lake and, Lost Bay for public access.
It isn't just a single approach with government, you know, protected national or provincial parks. We do have Charleston Lake Provincial Park and Frontenac Park and St. Lawrence Islands National Park. But in that whole sort of, I'll call it a matrix of conservation, the more that we can protect, you know, together, the more we're securing the future of this large but fundamentally important landscape. So that's my general comment. I don't know, Samara, if you have anything else to say.
Yeah, so Lost Bay, there's a short trail you can go on. Gananoque Lake isn't open to the public, but we do host events there. So if we have a BioBlitz, or I think in the chat it was answered that we do have an event coming up in June to actually tour Gananoque Lake, and specifically Steve is going to take us on a tour of his property. So if you're interested in visiting, please do sign up. I think the link is in the chat, and hopefully we can follow up with that information as well. You're also welcome to paddle Gananoque River. I haven't done it myself, but it's on my list. But you can paddle all the way from Lost Bay to Gananoque Lake and further down the river. Yeah, so lots of different ways to explore this beautiful region.
Yes, and you can see the big wetland that featured in some of the slides, up close and personal, if you do paddle and take the water route rather than the land route. So I recommend it if you can do it.
So we have two questions, which I promise aren't planted. So thank you for raising these. What's the deadline to raise money for this acquisition?
Mary, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so we were hoping to close, well, we're going to close the property hopefully in October. So we're really hoping that we can raise all the funds, well in advance of that. So we urge you not to wait to contribute. If you're looking to contribute, the sooner we know that we've raised all the funds, we can move forward. And obviously Steve is really excited about the prospect too. So we're hoping to raise all the funds hopefully by the end of the summer, so that we can actually move forward with transferring the property to Ontario Nature in October.
Okay.
Perhaps, John, I just wanted to interject a little bit. If for the showing of the property, which I believe is in June, I'm not quite sure. I think it's going to be open to members of Ontario Nature. Am I correct, Samira? What I should mention, if you would like to bring a canoe or a kayak, I would love to. First of all, it's easy. It's easy to get access to the water. There's a nice little lagoon, which actually has already been shown here. And there's about a 14-minute kayak or canoe ride around to the marsh right at the very base of Ontario Nature, of the current Ontario Nature property. So there's no reason that Samira should not be able to see this incredible marsh.
14 minutes sounds like you've done it a few times, Steve.
Took me a little bit longer than 14 minutes. But
That's
I might
fine.
be, botanizing and birding along the way, so that slows everything up.
Yeah, I think Steve learned walking with us naturalists. Sometimes you only get a couple of meters down the trail or along the way. But yes, just wanted to point out that invitation will be included in the follow-up email. So if you are looking to join us, you'll get that information.
Okay, quick question. So are motorized boats allowed to enter the confines of the nature reserve?
So I'm actually not sure about the rules around motorized boats in the larger lake, but certainly not on the shorelines of the nature reserve. We want to protect that natural habitat, and there's lots of species that are residing in those shoreline habitats, so not within the boundaries of the property.
If I can also, you mentioned the larger lake. In fact, unfortunately, motorized vehicles are allowed on the large lake, on Gananoque Lake. And there are small fishing boats all over the place with outboard engines on them. Luckily, there are very few motorized boats on Lake Gananoque.
There's a question about, are there any plans for a BioBlitz this summer or beyond?
Yeah, so not this summer, but we'll certainly look to conduct a full inventory after, we add this property to our nature reserve. So hopefully next summer we'll have one. And we do have some experts joining during the event in June. So I'm sure we'll see lots of interesting species then too.
Okay, here's a question. So any chance of acquiring the wetland itself or helping the province acquire it for protection? This is a significant wetland, so I'm not sure exactly which one's referenced there, but somebody field that.
I didn't quite catch the question.
So it says any chance of acquiring the wetland itself or helping the province acquire it for protection?
Well, part of the wetland is part of the Gananoque Lake nature, you know, a fair chunk to the north, I guess, of Wilty Creek.
Right.
So it'd be nice to protect more of it, but there is quite a chunk. I don't know what percentage would you say, Samara, is already protected?
Well, also the Conservation Authority owns a part of that potentially significant wetland as well. So I'm not sure totally across all conservation organizations what percentage of the wetland would be protected, but it's like certainly almost half of our Gananoque Lake Nature Reserve is that marsh and wetland and creek.
That's right. I may have been a bit confusing because I mentioned that the entire marsh is actually 8 square kilometers, which is correct. But I think that I've never calculated it, but I have tried to paddle through it, and it's a very big amount that Ontario Nature owns, and it must be approaching a third of it anyway. So that, you know, somewhere between 2 to 3 square kilometers is already owned by Ontario Nature.
Thank you. There's a question about whether the Gananoque property and the Yates parcel, is that contiguous?
Yeah, so it's directly adjacent. So Steve's our lovely neighbor, just to the northeast of our property. So again, really nice to have that directly contiguous habitat and including the shoreline as well. And so as Steve mentioned, I think in his first slide where he was sitting and looking out into that little bay, that's actually from his property looking onto Ontario Nature's property. So we're neighbors.
Okay, I think that's probably good. There's a couple more questions, but just in the interest of time, I think we should probably wrap up. If there's anything that you've asked or you're curious, please contact us on our website. We've got the main contact line that'll be directed to Samara, Stephen, or Caroline as applicable. Big thanks for all the panelists today. It was excellent, informative. And particularly Stephen, I think it's really really inspiring, the connection he's got and the vision he's got for that property. I think it's a beautiful thing. And I think that's it. So there's lots of, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to ask if there were questions. We have people's email addresses, so we could get back directly if there are questions that are unanswered at this point.
Yeah, there's a couple, so we'll I'll download those and share them. Yeah.
Yeah, there's one that I'm happy to answer. So yeah.
Great. Okay. Yeah, so I think that's it. There's lots more information about this property, the area on our website. So I encourage you to visit that. And thank you all for attending. Hope you have a beautiful rest of the evening.